In the automotive world, the early 90s saw a host of record breakers and a variety of nameplates that live on into the modern era. Hello friends, my name is Emile and welcome back to some more Forza Top Gear laps. Today we are taking a look at the iconic cars of the early 90s. And we start today with the Lotus Carlton, 379 horsepower, 3,641 pounds of weight. This is the heaviest vehicle here today. So the Lotus Carlton, of course, this was the fastest four-door saloon in the world for quite a long time, actually. I don't believe it was until the Maserati Quattroporte came along in 2004 to dethrone this vehicle. So yeah, it was a record breaker in its own right, fastest four-door saloon. And that, of course, meant that this car is most famous for being the car of choice for various bank robbers. Anyways, the Lotus Carlton, what's it like to actually drive? Well, it is quick. Like, even by modern standards, even by modern sports saloon standards, this car is very quick. Like, 379 horsepower, even by today's standards for saloon cars, that still is a hefty amount. Of course, another thing you might notice is it is a little bit slidey, of course, rear-wheel drive. In fact, every single vehicle here today is rear-wheel drive, save for one. Which is kind of amusing. Anyways, yeah, so it's a little bit on the slidey side, but still the Carlton is pretty darn good to drive. I do love the Lotus Carlton. I love just how sedate it looks. It literally just looks like a Vauxhall Carlton with a slight body kit on it. But when you actually get in it and drive it, it is a whole nother world. It is a cool car, this. Really, really liked it. Yeah, good car. Next up, we have the BMW M3 of the E30 generation. 215 horsepower, 2,762 pounds of weight. The E30, I believe, was the first M3, following on from the first ever M5, which came in 1988, which you saw go around the track in the last episode. Ever since then, the M3 has developed a reputation for being a pretty darn solid sports car, and by most automotive journalists' word, you can't really do much better than a BMW M3. Although me personally, I've never been a huge fan of the M3s. One thing the M3s are known for is a solid chassis, and believe me, the E30 does have a very solid chassis. It is a solid car to drive, this one. It really is. Pretty darn good, actually. A little bit on the slidey side for me. Of course, as you all know by now, for me personally, I prefer a car when it's not oversteering. I much prefer cars that sort of understeer over oversteer. I can just counter it a little bit better. But it's nothing I can't really handle in the E30. It is a solid car to drive, yeah. The E30 is, of course, the most sort of... what's the word I'm looking for? Most desirable of all the M3s. Most BMW fanboys really do like the E30, so hopefully it puts in a good showing for my sake and for their sake, because of course I will be lynched if it doesn't. But yeah, E30, solid car to drive actually, enjoyed it. Next up we have the Honda NSX-R from 1992, 276 horsepower, 2,712 pounds of weight. Now, you'll find this thing with most Japanese cars from the 90s. You'll notice that they have 276 horsepower. The reason for this is because there was a gentleman's agreement which was formed at some point around the 90s, where basically each Japanese automaker agreed to never make a car with over 276 horsepower. And you'll see it with this car, and you'll see it with the car which is coming next as well. Anyways, despite that, the Honda NSX is known for being one of the first ever truly everyday supercars. We looked at another one of these everyday supercars with the BMW M1 in the last episode, and the NSX really capitalised on that. Also, a little bit of a hint, the NSX is a car which is looking like it's going to become a true classic and a huge investment. So if you haven't bought one already and you've got 50 grand lying around, go buy one. It'll be worth 100 someday. Anyways, what is the NSX actually like to drive once you get through all of that? It's a great car to drive, actually. Again, this is another car which is known for an absolutely sorted chassis. Of course, developed by Ayrton Senna. He drove one, I think he even owned one back in '92, which is, I mean, if it's good enough for Senna, it really is good enough for you. Great car to drive, actually. I really enjoyed the NSX. Could do with a little bit more power, but it's a good car to drive nonetheless. Next up we have a Nissan Skyline R32, 276 horsepower. See, that figure comes up again. 3,307 pounds of weight. This is the only car here today that is all-wheel drive, only car here today which isn't rear-wheel drive. And considering this track is in the rain, you would think that would give this car an advantage, because of course rear-wheel drive in the rain is known for losing traction quite often. Anyways, what is the R32 actually like to drive? It is understeering. That is the leading characteristic of this car. I'm not really surprised, of course this is a more early four-wheel drive vehicle, production vehicle. And it's got a decent amount of power for a four-wheel drive production vehicle. 276 horsepower is a very reasonable amount. This is the second heaviest car here today as well, which doesn't exactly play particularly well into not making it understeer. Other than that though, it's an alright car to drive. Probably one of my least favourites here today, not in terms of like, the car isn't my least favourite, I love the R32 Skyline. But in terms of its actual handling, it's probably one of the weaker vehicles here today. But yeah, I still didn't think it was that bad, per se. Decent enough vehicles to drive with a couple of upgrades, maybe some front downforce, rear downforce. If you build this thing for time attack, I would assume it would be a very, very good car for that. As it stands stock, there is a bit of understeer, but other than that, it's a pretty decent car to drive. Next up, we have a McLaren F1. Are you really surprised to see this in here? 627 horsepower, 2,840 pounds of weight. This is by far and away the most powerful vehicle here today. Of course, the McLaren F1 was the fastest production car in the world until 2004, where it was dethroned by the Bugatti Veyron. And since then, Bugatti's basically dominated the fastest car in the world scene, with the Supersport Veyron currently being the fastest car in the world officially. Anyways, the McLaren F1, what is this thing like to drive? It is light, as in that's the prevailing handling characteristic of this. It feels so utterly weightless. However, it is stupidly quick. This thing is supersonic. This thing, it only has 627 horsepower, and I say only because most hypercars these days have, you know, upwards of 1,000 horsepower. The McLaren F1 is probably quicker than most of them. This car is ludicrously quick. The gearbox is a little bit of a problem. The gear ratios are a little bit on the longer side. It isn't such a bad problem for some reason in the wet. I had more of an issue with this car when it was in the dry with the gearbox. That was the main thing I complained about. Honestly though, for some reason I didn't really feel as strongly about it this time, mainly because the pull in each gear is ridiculous. Ridiculous car to drive, that one. Next up we have a Mazda MX-5 Miata, which is kind of the complete opposite, because this is the least powerful vehicle here today, by a long way, in fact almost by 100 horsepower, and it is also the lightest vehicle here today. It's 500 pounds lighter than the next lightest vehicle, which is the F1. Of course, the MX-5 Miata is known for being one of the most popular sport cars in the world. People absolutely adore the MX-5 Miata, and I do have to say I'm quite a fan of the car as well. Also, one cool thing about driving this car in the rain is the pop-up headlights are up, and that means this car looks very, very happy. I don't know. The MX-5 suffers from the same thing that the Stratos does, in the case that if it doesn't have the flip-up headlights up, it kind of looks a little bit odd. Anyways, what is the MX-5 like to drive? It is very fun. This car is a huge amount of fun to throw around the track. Admittedly, most of the MX-5s are, with the possible exception of the 05 Mazda Speed MX-5, because that car is very, very good handling. When I say fun, that doesn't usually mean the car's a great handling car. It has just enough grip to get it through the corners fine. It isn't frustrating, but you know, it'll tease you, it'll throw the rear end out a little bit. That's what this car does. It is a little bit on the slidey side, a little bit tail happy, but all in all, it is a nimble, fun car to drive. Definitely not quick by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, this thing's going to be more competing with the lowered power cars that we've had around before. Your Datsun 240Zs, Ford Escort, Opel Kadett, Mazda RX-3. But still a cool car nonetheless. And finally today we have the Ferrari F355 Berlinetta, 375 horsepower, 3,196 pounds of weight. The F355 was Ferrari's premier supercar for the 90s, before being replaced by the 360 Medina in the late 90s at some point, like really late 90s. Anyways, the F355, what many people seem to forget about this car, this was one of Ferrari's gem cars by most standards. Jeremy Clarkson himself bought one of these cars because he loved the way it drove so much. Anyways, what is the 355 like to drive? It is excellent. This is by far and away the most surprising vehicle I drove today. It is also the one that I would probably take away from this program and drive around the track forever, because the 355 is just such a balanced, well-driving car. This thing is absolutely great. 375 horsepower by modern supercar standards isn't a lot. Like, this thing, PI-wise, I believe is a B-class car. It sort of competes with your BMW M4s, Lexus RCFs. However, with sort of, if we're going to compare it to M4s, RCFs, RS4s, I would rather take this car just because of how excellent it is to drive. Also, it's only 63,000 credits for a full-fledged Ferrari supercar. That is ridiculous. Buy this car, buy it now. Anyways, moving on to the times, the McLaren F1 becomes our fastest car ever, beating the Ferrari F40 by 1 and a bit seconds, going into first place with a 120.065. The F355 Berlinetta puts in a pretty good shout, going into 7th with a 126.336, beats out an Audi RS5 and a Chevrolet Camaro SS. The Honda NSX is slightly slower than the Camaro, which is kind of surprising, with a 127.707, which would put it into 10th place. The R32 is in 11th with a 128.601, finally getting into that 128 category where no car has gone before yet. Beats out a Shelby Cobra and the Lotus Carlton, which goes into 13th with 129.826. Beats out the BMW M1. That's quick. Also, the M3 E30 beats the M5 marginally, going into 19th with 132.261, slightly slower than an R32 Golf though, which is kind of surprising. The R32 is quicker than I thought it would be. And finally today, of course, the slowest car of the day, the MX-5 Miata goes into 30th with a 138.276, slightly slower than an original GTR Skyline, slightly faster than a Datsun 240Z, and a Pontiac Firebird Trans Am, which is actually pretty respectable when you think about it. Although, of course, that car is by no means quick. Anyways, friends, that is it for today's episode. If you have any suggestions for cars you'd like to see go around the track, or even themes for me to look at in later episodes, then do let me know in the comment section below. Anyways, friends, I want to thank you all very much for watching. My name's been The Real Emile, and until next time, farewell.